One of them made a film so despised it was pulled from theaters after 1 week. One bankrupted a major studio. One vanished into obscurity after ranting that critics were a pack of diseased vultures. These are the box office bombs so disastrous they took their directors down with them. Alex Proyas had the kind of career most directors would kill for. The Crow was a hit even with all the tragedy behind the scenes. And Dark City? That one's a cult classic for a reason. Even when he toned it down for bigger commercial projects like I, Robot and Knowing, they still turned profits and kept his name in the Hollywood pipeline. The guy was clearly building towards something big, and then came Gods of Egypt. A giant fantasy spectacle that turned ancient Egyptian mythology into a CGI headache. This was his chance to break into the A-list. But everything about this film was off. Gerard Butler and Nikolai Coster-Waldau played Egyptian gods, because of course 2 pale Europeans were perfect casting. And sure, the film wasn't exactly aiming for realism. There's a scene where a god turns into a shiny metal falcon mid-battle and shoots lasers, but even fantasy has to have some logic. Instead, what we got was a loud, overblown mess with some of the worst dialogue and green screen work of the decade. The movie barely broke even on a $140 million budget. And instead of taking the hit and moving on, Proyas dug his own grave post-release. He went off on a Facebook tirade, blaming critics, calling them less than worthless and a pack of diseased vultures. At the end of the day, Proyas didn't just lose a movie, he lost Hollywood. Since Gods of Egypt, he hasn't directed a single major studio film. Just a handful of short films and that's it. Michael Lehmann kicked down the doors with Heathers. That film was sharp, nasty, funny as hell, and had an actual pulse. Hollywood noticed. Even his second feature, Meet the Applegates, didn't do much, but it was weird enough to keep him on the radar. So of course, someone thought the next logical step was to hand him a $65 million Bruce Willis vanity project, because that always ends well. Hudson Hawk wasn't just a flop. It was a baffling experiment in how far a studio could let a star indulge himself. Willis had been developing it for years. He co-wrote it, he sang in it, he had total control. And he burned through a fortune on a movie that didn't know if it was an action flick, a musical, or a Looney Tunes sketch. Joel Silver produced it, back when Joel Silver basically ran Warner Brothers, but even he couldn't save it. The result was a movie that confused critics, alienated audiences, and tanked at the US box office. $17 million domestic on a $65 million budget. Lehmann got thrown under a bus. The movie killed his shot at the big leagues. He kept working. Airheads, The Truth About Cats and Dogs, a ton of TV. But the guy who could have been a Tim Burton-style breakout ended up just another studio casualty. Roland Joffe had one hell of a start. The Killing Fields and The Mission weren't just Oscar bait, they were earned. Serious films, politically charged, gorgeous to look at. Joffe was considered a major filmmaker, someone who actually had something to say. And then he decided to direct The Scarlet Letter. Not the Hawthorne novel as people knew it. No, this version turned a Puritan morality tale into a sweaty, soft-focus romance with new age vibes and slow-motion sex scenes. Demi Moore was the lead. Gary Oldman and Robert Duvall showed up to class things up. But there's only so much they could do. It was marketed like prestige drama, but it played like a perfume commercial with Puritans. And it bombed. $10.4 million on a $46 million budget. Critics tore it to shreds. Joffe never recovered. He didn't stop working, but the films he made after that felt like he was chasing trends instead of setting them. Goodbye Lover wanted to be a 90s noir. Vittel was Miramax Awards bait that didn't land. Captivity tried to cash in on the torture wave, and that one was just flat out embarrassing. By the time the 2000s rolled around, Joffe was still around, but barely a blip. For a guy who once looked like he'd be one of the greats, The Scarlet Letter marked the end of anyone taking him seriously. Adrian Lyne was on fire in the 80s and early 90s. He kicked things off with Flashdance, gave us 9.5 Weeks, Fatal Attraction, Indecent Proposal, all stylish adult thrillers with actual substance. The guy had a signature. So when he took on Lolita in the mid-90s, it wasn't out of character. This was Lyne's thing, controversial adult material. Problem is, there's controversial, and then there's adapting Lolita with no filter. Kubrick had done it back in '62, but that version had to dance around the source material thanks to early '60s censorship. Line didn't have that problem, and that's exactly what became the problem. His take leaned hard into the tragic, twisted romance, made the whole thing more explicit. And by the time it was done, US distributors wanted nothing to do with it. It scraped together a limited release, pulled in just over $1 million at the box office, and instantly sank. This was a $62 million film that no one wanted to touch. Even though Jeremy Irons and Dominique Swain gave solid performances, it didn't matter. After that, Line's name was no longer floating to the top of any producer's list. He came back 5 years later with Unfaithful, which actually did okay. But by then, the kinds of movies he was known for were going out of fashion. And that was it. After Unfaithful, Line did not direct another film for 20 years. He finally resurfaced in 2022 with Deepwater, starring Ben Affleck and Ana de Armas, an erotic thriller that quietly got dumped onto Hulu and Amazon Prime. Stephen Norrington started out doing effects work, then jumped into directing with Death Machine, which had some cool ideas but didn't land big. Then came Blade. That movie changed everything. R-rated Marvel, Wesley Snipes kicking ass, a dark comic book world with kung fu and techno. It made money, it had style, and it gave Norrington serious clout. He could have coasted on that, but instead, he made The Last Minute, a strange personal satire that basically no one saw. It flopped, but it still had a voice. Studios figured he just needed the right property to get back on track. That property ended up being The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Based on Alan Moore's graphic novel, the concept sounded like a slam dunk, famous literary characters teaming up to fight evil. But in practice, it was a mess. Sean Connery signed on, and that's where the problems really started. He clashed constantly with Norrington. The production was chaotic, and the studio kept interfering. What came out the other side was a bloated, noisy, awkward movie with none of the style Norrington was known for. His voice got completely buried. It made $179 million off a $78 million budget. Not technically a bomb, but it wasn't the franchise starter Fox hoped for. And Norrington walked away from Hollywood entirely. He's been doing sculpture work ever since. He got attached to a couple of projects, Clash of the Titans, the Crow remake, but bailed on both before anything got made. He just checked out. Charles Laughton wasn't some rookie director trying to make a splash. He was already one of the most respected actors in the business. Mutiny on the Bounty, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Witness for the Prosecution. He'd worked with everybody. Hitchcock, David Lean, Kubrick, even Daniel Day-Lewis called him the greatest film actor of all time. So when he stepped behind the camera for the first time, expectations were sky high, and The Night of the Hunter delivered. It's visually stunning, dark, and anchored by one of Robert Mitchum's best performances, playing a fake preacher who's really a serial killer. Today, this film is untouchable. It's considered a masterpiece. But back in 1955, critics didn't know what to do with it, and audiences stayed away too. It made just over $1 million and confused just about everybody. Laughton was devastated. He never directed again, just shut that door completely and went back to acting. Not many people today remember that he had even attempted directing. The tragedy is, if The Night of the Hunter had landed even slightly better at the time, we might have seen an entire second career from him behind the camera, but it flopped, and that was that. Kevin Costner used to be untouchable. From the mid-'80s into the early '90s, the man could do anything. He was the old-school leading man who could jump from historical dramas to action blockbusters to romantic hits and rake in gold every time. The Untouchables, Robin Hood, Bull Durham, The Bodyguard, JFK, every move was the right one. And then he went and directed Dances with Wolves, and somehow came out the other side with 7 Oscars, Best Picture, Best Director. Overnight, he was no longer just a star, he was the guy. So when the time came for his next big directorial project, the press was hyped. Only problem was, by then, the shine was already starting to wear off. A messy divorce, bad press, and Waterworld, the most expensive movie ever made at the time, had already given him a dent or two. Waterworld wasn't the disaster people claimed it was, but its bloated budget and behind-the-scenes chaos made Costner look reckless. So what does he do to bounce back? He doubles down. Writes, directs, stars in The Postman, an apocalyptic epic where hope returns to America via junk mail. It's a bizarre mashup of Mad Max and Dances with Wolves, only slower, cornier, and 3 hours long. The $80 million budget sank into the dirt, and the movie crawled its way to just over $20 million. That was the end of Costner the Golden Boy. He eventually rebuilt his reputation as a solid actor. 13 Days, Mr. Brooks, and plenty of rugged mentor roles paid the bills. He even got another shot at directing with Open Range, which critics loved, but audiences didn't care. And in 2024, he tried one more time with Horizon, this massive 4-part Western saga. First chapter came out, costing $100 million, and it tanked. One of the biggest bombs of the year. Someone should have told him to stop. Seems like he didn't get the memo. Michael Powell was British cinema royalty. Alongside Emmerich Pressburger, he crafted some of the most celebrated films to ever come out of the UK. The Red Shoes, A Matter of Life and Death, Colonel Blimp. That partnership inspired everyone from Scorsese to Coppola. But when Powell decided to go solo, it all came crashing down. Peeping Tom was supposed to be his bold new direction, a psychological horror about a man who films women as he murders them. It was elegant, disturbing, and decades ahead of its time. But none of that mattered when it hit theaters. British critics tore it apart. Powell wasn't just criticized, he was destroyed. The man became a pariah basically overnight. The film made almost nothing, and Powell couldn't get another movie made in the UK. He ended up bouncing between Germany and Australia, doing low-budget work no one remembers. Eventually, Peeping Tom found new life in grindhouse and art house circuits in New York in the 70s, and critics finally re-evaluated it for what it was, one of the first slasher films and a masterclass in psychological horror. But by then, Powell's career was long gone. At least he lived to see his reputation restored before he passed. Michael Cimino went from unknown to Oscar-winning genius in just 2 films. Thunderbolt and Lightfoot put him on the map. The Deer Hunter made him a legend. For a minute, he was standing right alongside Scorsese and Coppola as one of the new gods of 70s cinema. And then he made Heaven's Gate. It was a bloated, overreaching, ridiculously long Western about the Johnson County War. The production spun completely out of control. Cimino was reshooting everything, bleeding the budget dry and ignoring any suggestion to rein it in. By the time it was done, the movie cost $44 million and barely made $3.5 million back. The fallout was nuclear. United Artists, a legendary studio, collapsed. Critics didn't just hate the film, they blamed Cimino personally for killing New Hollywood and bankrupting a studio. He kept working, but he never got full control again. Every film after was compromised. By the 1990s, Cimino was reduced to directing low-budget flops, and by the time of his death in 2016, he'd become a recluse. Chris Christopherson later said, "It was a beautiful film that got clobbered, but people were already gunning for Cimino." Didn't matter, he never recovered. Martin Brest had one hell of a run. Beverly Hills Cop made him a hitmaker. Midnight Run was one of the best buddy comedies of its era. And Scent of a Woman gave Al Pacino his first Oscar. Even The Misfire Meet Joe Black didn't derail him. And then came this one. What started as a crime movie with a dark comedic edge turned into a studio Frankenstein project. The Bennifer media circus was in full swing, and Columbia decided to cash in. They ordered massive reshoots to turn it into a romance. The result was a complete disaster. The jokes didn't land, the chemistry was non-existent, and the whole thing was dead on arrival. Even the UK pulled it from release a week after its premiere. The budget was $75 million. It made $7 million. That was it for Martin Brest. He didn't try to bounce back, he didn't shop new scripts, he just walked away. A couple of years later, he said, "Once this movie happened, I knew I'd never be invited back. I had a good run. I would have liked it to go on longer. But everybody likes everything to go on longer." And just like that, the guy behind Beverly Hills Cop was done.